This is our world map in 2024. We will be starting with the Russian-Ukrainian War. Recently, Russia has been gaining some ground on the Eastern Front, and Ukraine has started the Kursk offensive. By October 2024, the Ukrainians gained more land around Kursk. But the Russians continued to go on the offensive in eastern Ukraine, capturing many more towns and villages. It's now February 2025. It's been 3 years since the war started, and Belarus has officially joined the war. They go on the offensive, bombing several highways, railways, villages, and towns. In Switzerland, representatives from the West Bank, Gaza Strip, Israel, the United States, Iran, and Egypt meet to discuss how they're going to end the Gaza war. They decide on a split of Gaza. Egypt would take the southern half, and Israel would take the northern half. Zelensky, after seeing the heavy gains of Russian troops in the east, decides to put his all into the Kursk offensive. He takes tons of land near the Ukraine-Russia border, as well as pushing into Belarus. But this decision will lead to the end of Ukraine. Russia almost assassinates Zelensky, and Zelensky decides to retreat to Poland. At this point, the Western powers decide to launch a full-scale operation to stabilize Ukraine. The Western forces take a good chunk of western Ukraine as well as the major city of Odessa. The Russian forces also push back against the Kursk offensive as the Western forces reach Kyiv. The Ukrainian war is finally over. In the peace treaty, a new Western Ukrainian government is set up, and the Russians annex a ton of land in eastern Ukraine, and a Russian puppet state is set up around central eastern Ukraine area. I'm going to add some alliances to the map. On September 16, 2025, Artemis 2 launches from Cape Canaveral, Florida. It will take a crew of 4 astronauts, the furthest away we've been from Earth since the 1970s. Due to China's rapid growing influence in the Pacific region, India, Vietnam, South Korea, Japan, the Philippines, Australia, New Zealand, and United States form the Pacific Defensive Organization to combat China's growing influence. After several years of delay, the East African Federation is formed between Kenya, Uganda, Rwanda, Burundi, and Tanzania. The DRC and South Sudan were not able to join as they are causing too many problems in the unification process. In September 2026, Artemis 3 launches from Cape Canaveral, carrying the first crew of humans to visit the lunar surface since 1972. China joins the CSTO alliance and lands their own crew of humans on the moon. Yemen, Syria, Lebanon, and Iran join the CSTO alliance as NATO starts putting more warships in the Persian Gulf. After that, several countries join NATO, including Azerbaijan, Morocco, and Israel. India and the European Union established their own bases on the moon in May 2030, respectively named European Luna and Indian Luna. NATO and the Pacific Defense Organization started meeting and decide to merge into one mega alliance. Tensions between NATO and CSTO rise as Western Ukraine joins the WDO and Eastern Ukraine joins the CSTO. A lot more countries are deciding to take sides. On the moon, the first trade network is created between Artemis Base, European Luna, and Indian Luna. In Africa, South Sudan finally joins the East African Federation. After South Sudan joins the East African Federation, Somalia falls apart into a civil war. The different groups start fighting, and the EAF supporters get close to Mogadishu, and the Somaliland forces destroy part of the CSTO supported forces. Eventually, the CSTO supporters and the rebels collapse, and Somaliland and the EAF supporters take over the country. Japan makes their colony on the moon and names it Rula Base. It's actually Japanese. Tensions are quickly rising in the Middle East as Kurdistan finally wants their independence. After the Syrian civil war, Syria has still been unstable and is prone to collapsing. In 2036, Syria pulls out the final straw. Syria collapses into a civil war, and Kurdistan also spreads over into Iraq. ISIS also returns, taking a good chunk of Syria and part of western Iraq. Due to all the rebellion, the rest of Syria and a good chunk of Iraq collapse. Kurdistan also spreads over into Iran and Turkey, spreading to other major alliances into the war. Due to all the rebellion in the Middle East, the WDO sends their own forces into Iraq and Syria, and Turkey also builds a defensive line to contain the Kurdish rebels. Several things are happening all at once. The WDO continues to push into southern Iraq, and Turkey continues to gain more ground in Syria, and they push back against the Kurdish defenses. Also, Iran crosses the Zagros and starts their own invasion of Iraq to gain territory. Turkey finally decides to make peace with Kurdistan, settling on a border just north of the original border. However, the Western forces continue to push into Iraq, getting close to Baghdad, and the Iranians are also getting close to Baghdad. Everyone decides to make peace with Kurdistan, and now they're an official independent country. Israel surprises everyone by going on the offensive and taking Damascus in a matter of days. Iraq is pretty much split in half between an eastern area and a western area, and the rebels have been pushed down to obscurity. Finally, the war is over with an independent Kurdistan, and most of Syria and most of Iraq got occupied by Western forces, but a good chunk of eastern Iraq got occupied by Iranian forces. In the peace treaty, Iran gains some land in eastern Iraq, while Kurdistan gains their independence, and Turkey gains a good chunk of western Syria, as well as Israel annexing more land around southern Syria, as well as Saudi Arabia annexing a good chunk of southern Iraq. Ethiopia and Somaliland decide to unite into one country. On the lunar South Pole, trade networks are set up between all the colonies. A crew of 4 astronauts visit the original Apollo 11 landing site to make it into a tourist attraction to hopefully start making some money. Russia joins China on the moon as they establish their colony. In 2039, the Chinese finally invade Taiwan. They make some land gains in the south and the west of Taiwan, but are stopped by the heavy mountains of central Taiwan. After the invasion of Taiwan, the Chinese populace has had enough. First, Tibet rebels against China, and the Chinese populace starts massive protests in major Chinese cities. And the WDO starts bombing raids over major Chinese cities like Shanghai and Beijing. It looks like a major WDO invasion of the CSTO is coming. Russia sends troops into China to help out with the situation, but before they can do anything, the WDO begins their invasion of China. Xinjiang also rebels, and Mongolia joins the war to take back Inner Mongolia, and the Vietnamese and Indians start an offensive into southern China, while the Koreans invade North Korea, and Japan begins bombing raids over eastern Russia and Beijing. And in central China, the populace rebels against the Chinese government, taking huge swaths of land, including north of Beijing. But as the Americans, Chinese, Russians, North Koreans, and everyone that owns nukes on the entire planet starts firing them at each other, all of the nukes fail because they weren't maintained. China sends a ton of manpower to the front to push back the West, but everyone that arrives just decides, nah, I'm not going to fight this war. Because of that, the Western powers are able to gain a lot more land in eastern China. The rebellion spreads across central China as Western forces enter Beijing. China has been divided between Tibet, the rebellion, Xinjiang, and the Western powers, as well as the new rebellion up north, which takes control of a good chunk of eastern Russia and Manchuria. While Russia is distracted in China, the WDO begins their invasion of Russia, called Operation Barbarossa, but better. In the matter of 2 weeks, they push far into Russia. The Finns capture a lot of land in Karelia and Kola, and Baltic and Finnish forces encircle St. Petersburg, and NATO creates 2 flanks to capture Moscow. St. Petersburg falls, and Western forces enter Kazakhstan, and Iran surrenders, as well as they get close to Moscow. Finally, in the year 2040, WDO troops enter Moscow. To clarify, this was not World War III, although it kind of was. This was just the fall of the CSTO. Anyways, time for the peace treaty. Here are the borders of the peace treaty, and here it is, all colored in. In East Asia, there are a lot of changes that you can look at now. And in Europe, you can look at the changes that happen now. Here is the new world map. The WDO decides to invade the last few CSTO countries, as Turkey, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and India pretty much destroy Palestine, Lebanon, Pakistan, and Yemen. In the Americas, the United States takes out Nicaragua and Cuba in 1 day. The CSTO is officially over, as Pakistan and Yemen fall. After all the war that happened, this is our world map. The WDO dominates the Northern Hemisphere, and they dominate world trade. This is year 2042. On Luna, Russia and China are allowed to keep their colonies, and Artemis base expands. So it's easier to keep track of everything. I'm going to replace the base names, like Artemis base, Apollo base, with the country flags. So I think it looks a bit better. By 2042, the entire Gateway station is completed. It is 2 times larger than originally expected. But the more space allows for bigger missions to the outer solar system and to the red planet. Back on the moon, South Korea makes their moon colony, and Australia and New Zealand decide to make a combined moon colony under both countries. In Africa, a ton of countries, including Algeria, Egypt, South Africa, the EAF, and the West African Federation, decide to make their own alliance to help with Africa's development. In Latin America, all of the countries there decide to form into one alliance to help with trade, economics, and it is also a military alliance, just like NATO today. In Asia, the same thing happens, with several countries forming together to help with economics, economy, and it is also a military alliance. Who knew? The European Union, as it is today, still exists, but the EU is forming more and more into a country, and more countries in Europe are looking to join this alliance. In 2048, several expansions happen on the lunar South Pole with new trade works, and Brazil makes their moon colony. In 2049, humans make history by landing the first crew of humans on Bennu. Here is Bennu's surface map, I guess. Why not? On Luna, Indonesia makes their moon colony, as humans prepare to go to Mars in the year 2050. On January 23rd, 2050, 2 events happen. 1, the Baltics unite into one country, and a SpaceX Starship launches and docks with Gateway Station. Once it's there, it gathers its crew, resources, food, water, and fuel, and then it sets off to Mars. In the Arabian Peninsula, Kuwait and Qatar decide to unite with Saudi Arabia, and that southern Iraq kind of sort of country that was small and wasn't that stable unites with Kurdistan. Now Kurdistan basically just replaced Iraq. Western Sahara finally unites with Morocco after it basically just kind of disappears. All the officials just escaped into Algeria, and yep, it's officially part of Morocco now. After 7 months of travel time, the SpaceX Starship gets in orbit around Mars. There, they land after 2 weeks of remaining in orbit to check all the systems. The crew of 5 astronauts become the first ever people to walk on the Martian surface. Italy finally joins the European Union. Myanmar dies, and it is divided between India, China, and Thailand. Thailand, Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam decide to form into the Southeast Asian Union, or SIAM. On Luna, water is found underground all over the moon, so water is not only limited to the lunar South Pole anymore. This leads to further colonization of the rest of the lunar surface. Base Alpha expands, and the crew during missions reaches about 50 people. The Green Team forms, who was allied to the old CSTO and hates the Yellow Team. Benin joins Nigeria as tensions rise between the Yellow and Green Team. As things are chill for the next year, the Green Team launches a surprise attack on the Yellow Team, taking tons of land within the first couple weeks. Chad is the first country to go on the offensive, taking tons of land in the process. The Yellow Team is like, Green Team, you're not playing any slick, as they begin several offensives into the Green Team. Niger, Mauritania, and Libya decide to surrender to the Yellow Team forces. The Green Team decides to retreat to Angola, where they decide to surrender. The Yellow Team allows them to have Angola, plus some surrounding land, but no more than that. The new Angolan country decides to join the Purple Team. Here is the peace treaty. Belize, Honduras, Nicaragua, Costa Rica, El Salvador, Panama, and Guatemala unite into the Central American Union. On Luna, all of the bases expand, and the population reaches 30,000. China, the European Union, and India land their own humans on Mars. Kosovo decides to unite with Albania. Bahamas decides to join the USA, and now the eastern US has a new Hawaii. Malawi decides to join the East African Federation. Ethiopia sends a letter to Eritrea saying, "Join us or die." Eritrea picks die. Denmark, Sweden, and Norway unite into the Scandinavian Union. In Mexico, a civil war breaks out between the federal government and the cartels. The cartels take a good chunk of Mexico, taking Baja California and a good chunk of the Yucatan Peninsula. They rapidly advance into Mexico, approaching Mexico City. The Americans, with their superior weapons and army, push deep into Mexico, making a landing on the Yucatan Peninsula. Mexico's federal government collapses, and the Purple Team begins a mission to stabilize Mexico. Eventually, the Purple Team and the Blue Team split Mexico, and the only area remaining is Mexico City. Mexico comes back, this time in southern Mexico, with the Yucatan Peninsula and Mexico City, but the USA annexes northern Mexico. In 2067, the first crew of humans goes to Ceres, the first dwarf planet in the solar system. Before the mission, there are a few ground rules for colonizing Ceres. 1. Countries cannot directly claim land on Ceres, but alliances can. 2. Ceres will remain as a hub for asteroid mining in the asteroid belt. Northern Cameroon falls over to Nigeria and Chad. They just decide to join those two countries. By the end of the 2060s, asteroid mining begins to take off, and we see our first trillionaire, which is the CEO of a massive asteroid mining company. Lesotho and Eswatini decide to join South Africa, and Nepal decides to join India. Libya, after their economy crashes, decides to join Egypt. Finally, in Africa, several countries decide to unite into the Central African Federation. On Luna, the Scandinavian Union and Siam land on the moon. Outside of the first 4 bases, there hasn't been much of a push to colonize more of Mars, because Mars is a radiation-filled wasteland 200 million miles away from Earth. But countries have been more focused on colonizing the moon and near-Earth asteroids and starting colonizing the asteroid belt. But the population of Mars does grow to about 300 during missions. Turkey annexes Azerbaijan. Niger basically dies. They're divided between 4 countries. South Africa, Argentina, and Canada land their own humans on Luna. In a move that shocks everyone, the Rio Pact and the Green Team unite into one big alliance. Even more countries decide to join the new Rio Pact alliance. Zambia decides to join the East African Federation. Due to the rules of colonizing Ceres, a massive fleet of 4 rockets carrying 200 people go to Vesta to start colonizing it. Note, these colonies look huge, but in reality Vesta is only like 500 miles across, so these colonies aren't really that big. Lastly, a smaller US fleet goes to Pallas. This is also the last time we'll see Pallas, since Pallas doesn't have a surface map. Slovakia, Hungary, and Poland unite under the Volgograd Union. The countries of the former Yugoslavia unite, plus Albania and minus Slovenia, and Moldova, Romania, and Bulgaria unite into one union. Portugal and Iberia unite, and I want to give a few reasons why uniting is beneficial to countries by the 2080s. 1. It can help develop less well-off countries better, and it helps unite the world under one force. And plus, it's a no-brainer if countries are already part of the same alliance. In 2082, humanity makes a major breakthrough. We establish 2 colonies in Venus's atmosphere. For context, about 60 kilometers above Venus's surface, there's an atmospheric layer that is about the same atmospheric mass and density as Earth's atmosphere. They're named Venus Skybase 1 and Venus Skybase 2. In Africa, Togo and Ghana decide to unite with Nigeria. As the development of South America increases, there is increasing pressure to unite into one federated union. Paraguay and Uruguay decide to join Brazil for the economic benefits. On Vesta, the East African Federation makes their own landing on the asteroid. On Ceres, the Rio Pact and the WTO begin collecting water so people in their colonies can drink water. Canada and the United States unite to form the largest country on Earth. In the Unopia Peninsula, Japan makes their Mars base, as well as the East African Federation. And the first country that's not affiliated with any Earth country is created, named the Martian Federation. Here are the trade routes of the Unopia Peninsula. Kurdistan, after their economy crashes, decides to unite with Iran. On Luna, the Oceanian Union and the East African Federation expand their lunar bases. The entire Malay archipelago unites under one country. In the Arabian Peninsula, the United Arab Emirates and Oman decide to join the Arabian Union. Now the Arabian Peninsula is now one country. In Africa, the North African Union and Egypt unite to form the Greater Northern African Union. In Central Asia, Xinjiang, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan unite. Afghanistan and Pakistan unite in the one country. On Luna, the population grows exponentially, and most of the colonies expand in one way or another. On the lunar surface, the first country that isn't affiliated with any Earth nation is created. It is named Apollo, after the Apollo missions and Apollo, the Greek god. Turkmenistan, Grand Colombia, Angola, and the Peru-Bolivian Union formed their own alliance called the Axis, and they want to get revenge on the Purple Team, the Rio Pact, for no reason whatsoever. After 1 year of preparing their population, they go on the attack. They first make ground movements in Guyana and northern Chile. In Africa, the advance is a little slower, as Angola doesn't have the same amount of manpower as Gran Colombia or the Peru-Bolivian Union, but they make steady progress, now threatening Kinshasa and the capital Namibia. Eventually, by 2100, the Angolans managed to reach Lake Tanganyika, and they reach Botswana. In South America, the Rio Pact's forces are told to retreat back, and the forces manage to capture the Guianas as well as more of northern Chile, and an offensive is started to capture the Amazon. Eventually, the African forces come crumbling in, as they don't have enough manpower to hold up the front anymore. Angola surrenders. The land is eventually divided. The front line is stabilized, but the Axis is able to push into the Amazon and northern Argentina. Eventually, both teams decide to make peace, and new borders are drawn up. On Venus, Venus Skybase 1 and 2 grow slowly because when you're in the atmosphere, you can't really expand it that much. And a new skybase is created, Venus Skybase 3. However, colonization of Venus is limited as 1, they can't go to the surface, and 2, the airships are limited in size. Right now, the population is only about 250. The Visegrad Union decides to unite with the European Union. Sri Lanka decides to join India. I would say the map is boring, but is it anymore? In the Utopia Peninsula, Indonesia lands its own crew of humans on Mars, and all of the colonies expand. The population of Mars during transfer windows grows to a couple thousand. Chile and Argentina unite. In 2105, the first mission with humans is sent to the Jovian system. There, they bring the 2 first modules of the Galileo space station and land on both Callisto and Ganymede. Mali and Burkina Faso unite. After years of preparing, the Axis begins their attacks on the Orange Team, taking good chunks of Pakistan and Iran. The Orange Team doesn't know what to do, as the front lines collapse in Iran and Pakistan. Eventually, the front line expands in the Kazakhstan. A breakthrough happens on the Xinjiang front as the Axis forces manage to capture the Silk Road. Indonesia and other countries lead the Orange Team and join alliances like the Rio Pact or the WDO. Eventually, most of the Orange Team surrenders, and the WDO begins a liberation effort in Pakistan and Iran. In the peace treaty, Xinjiang, Pakistan, and Iran become Axis countries, and Turkmenistan expands a lot. The Kazakhstan joins Russia, and the WDO annexes some land. Nigeria, Mali, and the West African Union form together to form the Greater West African Union. Morocco joins the North African Union because their economy starts booming like crazy. The West African Union lands on Luna. Chad joins the West African Union. After the controversial presidential election of 2108, the North American Union falls into a civil war. The Axis sees this as their next opportunity to gain influence, and several Axis rebellions take over parts of the North American Union. Mexico made the North American Union think that they are on good terms, but in reality they weren't. Mexico wants their own land back, and they begin an invasion in the south of the North American Union. Article 5 is activated for the first time in 60 years. WTO countries such as India, Russia, and the Arabian Union come piling down on the Axis, taking huge swaths of land within a few weeks. There are several Rio Pact rebellions in the North American Union, and Canada not wanting to involve themselves with the Civil War break away from the North American Union. Eventually, this turns into the Third World War. Canada sends troops down south to liberate the United States, as WDO bombs several major cities in the Axis and the Rio Pact, as they begin an invasion into North Africa and North Brazil. Eventually, Russia falls into their second civil war in the past 200 years. The communist rebellions take over a good chunk of Western Russia, including Moscow and St. Petersburg, now threatening countries like Ukraine, the Baltics, the EU, and Finland. Eventually, the North American Union falls to the Rio Pact, Axis rebellions, and the Canadians. Elsewhere in the world, the Rio Pact begins an invasion of the Axis, and the Axis begins an invasion of the Rio Pact as WDO troops land in Western Africa to hopefully destabilize the entire continent. The communist rebellions spread through Russia and Ukraine, and the Oceanian Union begins an offensive into Indonesia. Everyone on Mars, Luna, Venus, Ceres, and Vesta do not want to go back to Earth because of all the war. You might think the world is dead, but it's not. There are 4 countries. There are 4 countries: Uzbekistan, Tibet, Mongolia, and Manchuria. They want a peaceful future for humanity, to colonize the rest of the solar system. But to do that, they must stop the Rio Pact, the Axis, and the WDO. They begin their invasion. Eventually, countries all around the world begin to join the Pink Team, including the Oceanic Union, South Africa, and the European Union. They agree with what the Pink Team wants, and they're determined to take down the WDO, Axis, and the Rio Pact. Due to this, the alliances begin to collapse. First, the Axis. The WDO and the Rio Pact are still fighting, however, as the Axis government and the Peruvian-Bolivian Union collapse. However, the Rio Pact countries in North Africa begin to collapse, including the West African Federation and the North African Union. Eventually, the North American Union has returned on the side of the Pink Team. Eventually, Russia falls over to the Commies. The Commies eventually fall over to the Pink Team, as well as the rest of the countries in Europe. The WTO collapses, and all the countries of the world, besides the EAF, Central African Federation, the West African Federation, Sudan, and Ethiopia, all join the Pink Team. The entire world is almost unified by the Pink Alliance. The only area that remains is a small area within the East African Federation. The entire world is now unified by the Pink Alliance. In the peace treaty, no border changes. Their belief is that the war was caused by the Civil War in the North American Union. They don't believe that they need to change the borders, and that will just cause more conflict. Also, this is not the WDO. It's just easier to make it blue. The countries are able to fix the devastation caused by the war within a year, and they are ready to continue to colonize the solar system. In their push for unification, the Balkans decide to join the European Union. On Ceres, while the war was occurring, the colony grew in population and size, and it is now a unified country and its own independent country, not related to Earth politics. In Europe, Ukraine and the Baltics joined the EU. On Mars, the Oceanic Union, the Nordic Union, Mars, and Turkey landed the Unopia Peninsula. In the year 2117, the first colonies are made in the Jovian system. The EU establishes a colony on Callisto, and the North American Union makes a colony on Ganymede.